I have been drawing maps for 43 cycles. Not the decorative kind. Not the cartouche and flourish productions that hang in the great halls of Consortium embassies. Those gorgeous, useless things with their gilded border beasts and their pride of place above the receiving chairs of species who want visitors to think the known universe is ordered and comprehensible and fully named. I draw the working kind. The cold kind. The kind that gets loaded onto survey vessels at the start of a mapping run and comes back scored with corrections, amended in the field, the original lines sometimes so thoroughly crossed out and redrawn that the finished chart looks like two different minds argued over the same void and neither fully won. My charts are not beautiful. They are correct. For 43 cycles, that has been enough. My name is Sorvanu Kell. I am a principal surveyor, 3rd rank, attached to the Consortium Cartographic Bureau, Western Meridian Division. I hold licenses to chart contested void space, anomalous stellar phenomena, and what the Bureau calls Class 5 ambiguities. That last designation covering, in the official language of the Bureau's licensing charter, any sector in which normal survey methods yield incomplete, contradictory, or inexplicable data. The charter describes Class 5 work as requiring, and I am quoting here from memory because I have read that sentence so many times its cadence has become my own, extraordinary professional discretion, multi-cycle experience, and a thorough internalization of the Bureau's boundary protocols. I have internalized every one of those protocols. I helped write 2 of them. I want to make that clear before I say what comes next. I want you to understand that I was not a novice. I was not an idealist. I was not the sort of cartographer who romanticizes the blank spaces. In 43 cycles, I had encountered 11 Class 5 designations, resolved 8 of them to full charted status, and recommended the remaining 3 for indefinite suspension pending development of measurement technology that didn't yet exist. I knew what blanks were. They were administrative placeholders for incomplete data, nothing more. That is what I believed, until the 68th day of survey mandate GX 7741 Theta. I will set down what I know and what I saw and what I did afterward. I will set it down in order, because order is the only tool I have left, and because the Bureau deserves a record even if the Bureau will never file this one publicly, and because if I do not write it out in sequence, I will not be able to write it at all. I have already tried twice. Both times I began in the middle with the chamber and both times the writing collapsed. So I will begin at the beginning. I will begin with the chart. Every working cartographer in the Consortium has a mentor. Mine was a senior surveyor named Dravar, old when I met him, ancient by the time he retired, a small and meticulous H-Vori male who had spent 60 cycles mapping the outer meridian belts and who had the peculiar professional habit of annotating his personal working charts with marginalia so dense they sometimes obscured the original line work. He was not famous. He was not celebrated. He was the best cartographer I have ever known. Dravar taught me the Bureau's protocols, and he taught me the science, and he taught me the 47 specific situations in which the science and the protocols would tell you opposite things, and you would have to decide which one to follow. But there was one thing he taught me that was not in any protocol and not in any scientific framework, and he taught it to me on my 3rd day of apprenticeship, before I had so much as touched a chart stylus. He took me to the great working map that covered the full south wall of his studio, a composite chart of the known galaxy in its entirety, built up over decades from hundreds of individual survey records, pinned and notated and corrected and recorrected, until it was as close to a living document as anything made of vellum and pigment can be. And he put one finger on a region to the galactic west of what was then called the Thornway Reaches. "What do you see?" he said. I looked at the region under his finger. It was blank. Not blank the way unexplored space is blank. I had already learned the difference between white blank, which means uncharted, and gray blank, which means charted and empty, and the pale yellow blank used for sectors where survey data existed but remained formally incomplete. This was none of those. It was a particular kind of blank I had not seen before and did not have a name for. The surrounding regions had their designations, their stellar density notations, their traffic hazard markers, and their gravitational anomaly flags. The blank region had nothing. It did not even have a border. It simply stopped, the surrounding chart abruptly ending at what I would later learn to recognize as a deliberate terminus, a line drawn with purpose and not with measurement, and then whiteness. The blank was not inside the chart. It was the absence of chart. "I see a gap," I said. Dravarthes took his finger away and looked at me with the particular expression he used when a student had given an answer that was technically correct and entirely wrong. "You see a decision," he said. "Someone made a decision not to chart that space. Your job, for the rest of your career, is to understand the difference between a gap that exists because no one has been there yet, and a gap that exists because someone who went there decided the rest of us should not know what they found." I asked him what was in that blank space. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he hadn't heard me or had chosen not to answer. Then he said, "Human space." I knew about humans. Every species in the Consortium knows about humans. You learn about them the way you learn about the theoretical limits of stellar mass, as an abstract boundary condition, a thing defined by the edges of your own equations rather than by any direct experience. Humans are the reason the Bureau's licensing charter includes the phrase, "Do not approach," in 11 separate places without ever specifying what you are not to approach. Humans are the reason there is a Class 5 designation at all. Humans are the reason experienced cartographers, when they are teaching apprentices, bring them to the south wall and put a finger on a specific blank and say, "Not a gap, a decision." "What happened to the surveys that tried?" I asked. Dravarthes pulled his hand back from the wall. He went to his drafting table and sat down, and he did not look at the blank region again, and he said, in the same voice he used to explain orbital mechanics and stellar drift calculations, "The Bureau does not maintain a record of surveys attempted within or proximate to human space. The Bureau has found that maintaining such a record serves no useful cartographic purpose." I was 21 years old. I was 3 days into my apprenticeship. I understood, with the instinct of a young mind presented with a deliberately closed door, that what Dravarthes had just told me was not the whole truth, and that the whole truth was not something he was going to tell me in a studio with the door open, and quite possibly not something he was going to tell me at all. I let it rest. For 40 years I let it rest. In those 40 years I became what I set out to become. I mapped the Vithrani corridor, a long, thin finger of navigable space between 2 dead star clusters that 3 prior surveyors had declared impassable and which I proved passable, expensively and slowly, by spending 11 months inside it. I charted the Dravari anomaly, a region of severe gravitational irregularity in the outer eastern meridian, where the stellar density patterns suggested the remnant signature of a mass extinction event of unusual speed. Though what caused the event and what inhabited the region before it were questions outside my brief, and I did not speculate about them in my filed reports. I mapped the boundary of the quorum exclusion zone twice, the second time after the exclusion was formally ratified, and the boundary coordinates needed verification against the political reality. I have been to 29 of the 32 recognized galactic sectors, and to fragments of the remaining 3. I have logged over 1 million stellar units in survey transit. I have filed more than 400 completed survey mandates. In all of that, in 40 cycles of mapping the galaxy's corners and corridors and contested margins, I never went near the western threshold. Not because the Bureau restricted me from the adjacent sectors, which they did not, but because I understood that the blank was a decision, and I respected the person who had made it, whoever that person was, and because Dravarthes had taught me that the most important skill a cartographer could possess was the discipline to leave certain things unmapped. Or I believed I understood that. I believed, with the professional confidence of a surveyor who had spent 40 cycles applying good judgment in difficult situations, that I had internalized the lesson. I had internalized the words. The lesson took longer. Survey Mandate GX 7741 Theta was issued by the Bureau's Outer Boundary Renewal Division in the second month of the 43rd cycle of my career. The mandate's stated purpose was boundary confirmation, a routine recertification of the formal limits of charted space along a specific longitudinal transect running through what the Bureau's working charts designated as the Western Threshold. The Western Threshold is the collective name for the cluster of sectors immediately adjacent to the blank that Dravar Thess showed me 40 years before. My mentor had been dead for 11 cycles by the time the mandate reached my desk. The mandate was routine in its format. Standard Bureau language, standard authorization signatures, standard equipment specifications. I had processed hundreds of similar mandates. The only thing unusual about GX 7741 Theta was a single addendum, appended to the last page in a font 2 sizes smaller than the main body text, which read, "Survey vessel may approach the threshold boundary to within 12 stellar units for purposes of boundary marker verification. Survey vessel will not cross the threshold boundary under any circumstances. Confirmation of boundary positions is sufficient to satisfy mandate requirements." In 43 cycles, I had never received a mandate that included the phrase, "under any circumstances." I read the addendum 3 times. I filed the mandate in the pending stack. I spent 4 days drafting the equipment requisition and vessel assignment paperwork. I spent another 3 days convincing myself that the addendum was standard language, that "under any circumstances" was simply the Bureau's way of emphasizing that boundary confirmation did not require boundary crossing, which was obvious and correct, and not alarming in the slightest. By the time I boarded the survey vessel RVB Sorvanu Kel, named, as the Bureau names all its senior surveyors' vessels, for the surveyor currently attached to it, I had almost managed to believe that. The RVB Sorvanu Kel was a Class 4 independent survey vessel, fast, minimal crew, outfitted for solo long-range work. The crew complement for GX 7741 Theta was myself and 2 technicians, a young Brev male named Ervath who handled the sensor systems, and an older H-Vori female named Tessin Mar who had 20 cycles of boundary work behind her and who I had worked with on 6 previous mandates. I trusted Tessin Mar's judgment more than almost anyone else at the Bureau. I want to be precise about that. I want to state clearly that what I did on the 68th day of the survey was not done in consultation with my crew. It was done in the hour between 2nd and 3rd watch, when both Tessin Mar and Ervath were off duty. I made the decision alone. Whatever came from it is mine alone. The first 67 days of GX 7741 Theta were as routine as the mandate's language suggested. We moved along the transect from east to west, pausing at each designated boundary marker to verify position, record condition, update the working chart. The markers are physical objects, great dark pylons, 3 times the height of my vessel, anchored in void space at precise gravitational nodes, and carved with the Bureau's designation codes in 6 Consortium languages. They have been in place for an unknown period of time. The Bureau's records do not include an installation date for the Western Threshold markers, which I noted in my survey log as a data gap without, at the time, thinking much of it. By the 65th day, we were within the innermost ring of markers, the 12 positioned closest to the blank. The chart showed these 12 as a rough arc, curving to follow the boundary's edge. I had always assumed, working from the chart alone, that the boundary was defined by some natural phenomenon, the edge of a stellar density gradient, perhaps, or a gravitational influence from an anomalously massive object on the other side. Looking at the markers up close, I revised that assumption. The markers had not been placed to follow a natural feature. The natural feature, if there was one, had been made to follow the markers. The blank was not a cartographic convenience. It was a surveyed boundary, placed by intent, maintained with precision. Someone, at some point, had measured human space and drawn a line around it and put pylons in the void to say, "Here the galaxy ends." The charter for those pylons was not in the Bureau's records either. I noticed, on the 65th day, that the pylon material was the same dark substance as the annotated structures I did not yet know existed inside the boundary. I did not, of course, know that then. I noticed only that the pylon material was unusual, darker than its albedo should have allowed in this stellar neighborhood, with that same quality of improbable regularity in its surface, as if the material had been selected for specific properties rather than quarried for convenience. I noted this in my survey log and moved on, because noting unexplained material properties is part of the job and speculating about them in the log is not. On the 66th day, I did something I had never done before on a boundary survey. I drafted a question and submitted it to the Bureau's administrative channel, asking for the installation records of the western threshold markers. This is a routine request. Surveyor's due diligence. The Bureau sent an acknowledgement within an hour, which meant the receiving clerk had processed it, and then nothing further for 2 days, which was unusual. On the 68th day, at approximately the 4th hour of first watch, the Bureau's response arrived. It consisted of a single sentence. Records pertaining to the installation or maintenance of western threshold markers are not available for distribution to field survey personnel. I read it twice. I should have filed the response, logged the data gap, completed the boundary confirmation, and returned. I have gone over this moment many times in the 11 months since it happened. I understand that I should have done exactly that. I understand that a response of that kind from the Bureau is not an invitation to inquiry. It is the opposite. It is a closed door. I had been a cartographer for 43 cycles. I had never, not once, encountered a Bureau record that was unavailable to field survey personnel. The Bureau's entire operational framework rests on the principle that a surveyor in the field must have access to all available relevant data. That is not a preference or a custom. It is written into the charter. Records unavailable to field personnel was not a category that was supposed to exist. At 3:17 hours ship time on the 68th day of survey mandate GX 7741 Theta, I took manual control of the RVB Sorvanu Kel and crossed the western threshold boundary. I have thought carefully about how to describe what happened next. I'm aware that my description will sound, to anyone reading it through the framework of normal survey practice, either technically improbable or personally compromised. I am prepared for that. I am going to describe what I observed, in the order I observed it, as accurately as my instruments recorded it and as precisely as my memory retains it. I will not editorialize. I am a cartographer. I deal in observed phenomena. The sector immediately inside the boundary, the first 12 stellar units beyond the innermost marker row, looked, on every instrument I had, exactly like the sector outside it. Same stellar density, same background radiation, same gravitational gradient. If I had been reading only my instruments, I would have concluded that the boundary was artificial in the strictest sense, a line drawn on a chart with nothing physical to correspond to it on either side. The instruments showed me empty space. What the instruments did not show me, what no instrument I carry is calibrated to measure, was the sensation of crossing that line. I have no scientific vocabulary for it. I have only experiential vocabulary, and experiential vocabulary is inexact, and I know it. But I will set it down because it is part of the record, and the record demands honesty before it demands precision. Crossing the threshold boundary felt like entering a place that had been waiting, not waiting for me specifically, not waiting with any particular intention. Waiting the way a room waits when the person who last occupied it has not returned, when everything in it is exactly as they left it, when the absence of the occupant is so total and so long that the room itself has become a record of that absence. There was no change in the air, there was no air. I was in my vessel. There was no sound. My instruments showed empty space. And yet I had the absolute and immediate conviction that I had stepped through a door I had not been meant to open, and that what was on the other side of that door was not unaware of my having done so. I flew the vessel forward, slowly, sensor suite running at full resolution. I was making a chart. That is what I told myself. I am making a chart. This is what I am here to do. At 17 stellar units inside the boundary, the first anomaly appeared on my readings. It was not a stellar object. The sensors designated it as an unknown class solid mass, approximately 40 kilometers in its longest dimension, in a stable orbit around a star. I had no designation for a star that was not on the blank, because the blank had nothing on it. The star existed. The object orbited it. Both of them were simply absent from every chart ever made, which meant either that no survey had ever reached this point, or that every survey that had reached this point had declined to record what it found. I adjusted course and approached. The object resolved on my visual sensors at a range of 800 kilometers. It was not a natural formation. I want to be explicit about that. I have surveyed 17,000 separate stellar objects in 43 cycles, and I know the difference between a rock shaped by geological process and a rock shaped by intent. This had been shaped by intent. It was a structure. Old, unmistakably, profoundly old, in the way that certain objects are old not because of the physical evidence of their age, though that evidence was present in abundance, but because of some quality that precedes measurement, some intuition the eye arrives at before the instruments confirm it. The material was dark, darker than its albedo should have allowed at this distance from its star, and regular in a way that natural objects are not. The surfaces flat where they should have been curved, the angles sharp where geology would have rounded them, the overall form resolving as I drew closer into something that I had to keep correcting myself about, because my first instinct was to reach for architectural vocabulary rather than geological. And I did not want to use architectural vocabulary until I was certain it was warranted. It was warranted. At 400 kilometers, I could see the structure in full. It was a complex. Not a single object, an array of them, connected by spans I had no word for, arranged around a central form that was, in its basic geometry, a rectangular solid approximately 3 kilometers along its major axis. The spans and subsidiary structures were smaller, some of them dark and featureless, others scored with markings that my resolution at that distance could not fully render. The central form, the 3-kilometer rectangular solid, had an opening, not a fracture, not a collapse. An opening with the clean geometry of an aperture, facing toward the star. I held station at 400 kilometers and ran every passive sensor I had. I got age estimates. I ran them 3 times because the first result seemed wrong. The results were consistent. The structure's surface material returned an age estimate of between 400,000 and 600,000 standard years, with a confidence margin of plus or minus 40,000 years. The Consortium's earliest spacefaring species achieved stable interstellar travel approximately 90,000 years ago. I recalibrated my sensors. I ran the estimate again. The result did not change. I am a cartographer. What I do, in practical terms, is observe phenomena and record their position and characteristics accurately enough that another person can find them again. That is the whole of the discipline. What I do not do, what I am not trained to do, and what GX 7741 Theta did not authorize me to do is investigate what I find. I am not a xenoarchaeologist. I am not a first contact specialist. I am not an anomaly researcher. I observe and record. I brought the vessel into 50 kilometers. The markings on the subsidiary structures were legible at that range. I say legible, I mean visually distinguishable as marks rather than natural surface variation. They were not in any language I have ever encountered in 43 cycles of survey work, which itself encompasses dozens of extinct and active species communication systems. They were not, as far as I could determine with my available instrumentation, random. They were arranged in patterns. Long parallel rows broken at regular intervals by perpendicular notations, in a system that resembled, and I choose this comparison carefully, because it is the most precise analogy I have, a chart. A map. The markings on the surface of a 400,000-year-old structure, inside the blank sector, arranged in the form of a map. I have been making charts for 43 cycles. You develop an intuition for what a record looks like, regardless of the medium. You develop a sensitivity to the formal logic of spatial notation, the way information about positions and distances gets encoded in marks on a surface, that eventually begins to feel less like a learned skill and more like a sense. I cannot tell you what species made those marks. I cannot tell you what language they used or what system of spatial reference they employed. I can tell you with complete professional confidence that what covered the surface of those structures was a catalog of positions. I began recording everything, every surface I could image, every span, every subsidiary form, every mark. I was not thinking about the mandate. I was not thinking about the boundary I had crossed or the prohibition in the addendum or the Bureau's response about unavailable records. I was thinking about the chart. There was a chart here, older than the Consortium's oldest member species' first starship, and I was going to record it, and that was what I was going to do with whatever time I had. I had 4 hours. I spent the first 2 moving the vessel systematically around the outer structures, imaging every surface. The markings repeated, the same patterns in multiple locations, the same positional catalog rendered again and again across different surfaces, as if the makers had understood that the physical record might degrade unevenly and had made copies, many copies, so that if 9/10 of the original was lost, the remaining 10th would still contain the whole. That repetition told me something about the makers. Whoever they were, they had not built this structure as an administrative convenience or an ornamental monument. They had built it to last. They had built it specifically to be found by someone, eventually, who would be able to read it. They had encoded the record with the redundancy of a people who understood that they might not survive to explain it themselves. I did not, at the time, dwell on that last thought. I am dwelling on it now. A structure built to survive its makers. A record encoded as if the makers knew they would not be present to decode it. The structure's age, 400,000 years, means that whatever species placed it there has been absent for longer than the Consortium's entire history of spaceflight. Whatever they knew, whatever they were trying to preserve, they were trying to preserve it for someone who would come later, under circumstances they could not predict, without any of the cultural or linguistic context that their own contemporaries would have possessed. They built a record designed to be understood by a stranger. They built it inside the blank, inside the boundary, inside the space that no one was supposed to enter, and they built it to be found by whoever entered anyway. At the end of the second hour, I brought the vessel to the aperture in the central form. I want to be honest about my state of mind at this point. I was not frightened. I should have been frightened. I understand that now, with the clarity that comes from being on the other side of an experience and looking back at your earlier self with the particular despair of recognizing your own blindness. I was not frightened because I was a senior surveyor with 43 cycles behind me and a professional framework that had, until that moment, successfully absorbed everything the void had given me to absorb. Anomalies do not scare experienced cartographers. Anomalies are the job. The blank had become an anomaly, and I was going to resolve it. The aperture was large enough for my vessel. I took the RVB Sorvanu Kell inside. The interior of the central structure was a single chamber. I say single, it was, in the sense that there were no interior partitions, no divisions, no separate rooms or corridors. The space was undivided, and its dimensions were those of the structure itself. Approximately 3 kilometers by 400 meters by 400 meters, a long rectangular volume lit, at the moment of my entry, by nothing except the light that entered through the aperture behind me and the running lights of my vessel. My instruments confirmed atmosphere, breathable by my species standards, which I noted and then noted again because a 400,000-year-old structure in a sealed sector maintaining atmosphere is itself a finding of extraordinary significance. I did not note it a third time because by then I was looking at the walls. The walls of the chamber were not stone. Or rather, they were stone in the same way the exterior was stone, the same dark material with the same improbable regularity, but the interior surfaces had been worked with a precision that the exterior only approximated. The markings here were not the repeated positional catalog I had seen outside. They were something else, something with more internal structure, more hierarchical organization, the visual density of text rather than the spatial regularity of a map. Long columns of marks, broken by what looked like headings, broken by what looked like subheadings, running from a level I could not reach at the top of the walls down to the floor, which was itself marked with a single large form that I could only see in its entirety from altitude, and which I took to be a diagram of some kind. I want to describe the floor diagram carefully because I have thought about it often in the 11 months since I saw it, and I believe I understand now what I was looking at, even though I did not understand it then. From altitude, from 200 meters above the chamber floor, the floor diagram was circular, centered, with radiating elements extending from its center toward the walls. That basic description makes it sound simple. It was not simple. Each radiating element was subdivided, and each subdivision carried its own marks, and the marks within each subdivision had a different density and character than the marks on the walls, and the whole thing was oriented toward the end of the chamber, toward the end wall, in a way that made it impossible to look at the diagram without also looking, eventually, at the end wall. The diagram was not the primary document. It was a key. A legend, in the cartographic sense, the element that tells you how to read everything else. I spent 20 minutes at altitude documenting the floor diagram. I spent another 40 minutes moving the vessel along the walls, imaging column by column, systematic as I could manage, the way I would image any surface that contained information I needed to record before I could interpret. I was 3 hours and 40 minutes into the 4 hours I had allocated myself when I reached the end of the chamber. The end wall was different from the others. Where the side walls held their dense columnar text, the end wall held a single image. I have sat with this for 11 months. I have gone back to my recordings of it many times. I am going to describe what I saw, and I am going to do so in the plainest language I can, and I am going to resist the impulse to interpret before I describe, because interpretation is where I lose the thread of what is actually real, and what I made of it afterward. The image on the end wall covered the full surface, 380 meters high, 400 meters wide, carved into the dark material at a depth of approximately 3 centimeters, the carving precise enough that I could resolve individual lines at 50 meters. It was a map. I recognized it immediately as a map because I have spent 43 cycles looking at maps, and the formal logic of spatial notation is the same regardless of the medium and apparently regardless of the age. Stars rendered as points, systems rendered as points with orbital notation, sectors bounded by lines. The rendering style was unlike anything in the Bureau's current cartographic convention, but the underlying logic was identical. I was looking at a map of the galaxy. The map was annotated. Every region had marks that I understood by their position and density to be designations, names, or whatever the equivalent of names was in the system this map used. every region except one. I found the blank immediately. You always find the blank immediately, once you know what you are looking for. It was in the Galactic West, in the region corresponding to what the Bureau's current charts call the Western Threshold and the area beyond it. The blank in this map was not a blank in the same sense as the blank on our charts. It was not an absence of information. It had been marked. The mark was not a designation in the same script as the rest of the annotations. It was different, heavier, deeper cut into the stone, in a script I did not recognize from the rest of the chamber's text. A single mark, distinct from every other annotation on the map, placed over the region containing what I know as human space. I imaged it. I imaged it from every angle I had. I spent the last 20 minutes of my 4-hour window imaging that one mark and the immediate area around it on the wall, because I understood without being able to articulate why that the mark was the point of the structure. The map existed to provide context. The text existed to provide record. The chamber existed to house the wall. The wall existed to carry the map. The map existed to say one thing, and that one thing was encoded in that single mark over the western region. I could not read it. I want to be honest about that. I am a cartographer, not a linguist, not a xenolinguist, and even if I had been a xenolinguist, the mark was in a script from 400,000 years ago, entirely outside any known linguistic tradition. I could not read it. But I have been making maps for 43 cycles, and you learn, after enough cycles, to read the intention behind a mark even when you cannot read the mark itself. You learn the grammar of cartographic decision-making. You learn why a mapmaker puts a symbol in one place and not another, and what that choice says about the mapmaker's understanding of the thing being symbolized, and what the specific character of the symbol says about the nature of the distinction the mapmaker is drawing. You learn the difference between a symbol that says this place is dangerous, and a symbol that says this place is sacred, and a symbol that says this place is prohibited, and a symbol that says this place is the source. The mark was not a warning. It was not a prohibition, in the sense of a restriction placed by an authority on a population that might otherwise approach. The Bureau's boundary markers outside were warnings. In that sense, that is what a pylon in void space with "Do Not Cross" encoded on it is. But the mark on the wall was older than the pylons by orders of magnitude, and it had not been placed by the same hand, and it did not carry the same grammar. What it carried, and I want to be careful here, because I am aware that I am a cartographer interpreting a mark in a script I cannot read from a species that died 400,000 years before my own species developed agriculture, and everything I say about its meaning is inference, and inference is not record. What it carried was the grammar of an exception. The mark said, "This region does not belong in the same category as the others, not because it is more dangerous, not because it is forbidden, because it is the reason for the others. Because the map exists to record everything, except the thing from which everything the map records was measured. Every map has a datum, a reference point from which all other positions are calculated. Every map, without exception, every map I have ever made in 43 cycles, has a point you fix first and measure from, and every other point exists in relation to it. Some datums are arbitrary. You pick a stable star, you designate it 0, you measure from there. Some datums are not arbitrary. Some datums are the thing the whole chart was built around. The mark was not a warning that human space was dangerous. The mark was a notation that human space was the datum. Everything else on that 400,000-year-old galactic map had been positioned in relation to it. The makers had not left human space blank because they did not know what was there. They had left it blank because you do not annotate your datum the way you annotate the things you measure from it. You leave your datum as a reference point. You leave it as the fixed thing. You leave it blank because filling it in would imply that it was measurable from somewhere else, and there was nowhere else. I am not a theologian. I am not a philosopher. I am not, as I have said, a xenolinguist or a xenoarchaeologist or anything other than a cartographer. What I am about to say is not theology and not philosophy. It is a cartographer's interpretation of a cartographic choice made by someone who understood cartography well enough to build a 400,000-year-old structure, specifically to encode that choice. Whoever made that map was not afraid of humans. They were not afraid of what humans might do to the Consortium. They were not afraid of what humans might do to the galaxy. They were afraid, if afraid is even the right word, and I am not certain it is, of what would happen to the map itself, to the project of recording and naming and positioning and knowing, if the datum was ever treated as just another annotated region. If someone filled it in. If someone named it the way you name everything else. If someone decided that the reference point could be measured and bounded and designated and added to the catalog. Because the blank is not there to protect us from what's inside it. The blank is there to protect the map. I left the chamber. I flew the vessel back through the aperture, back out into the sector, back across the 12 stellar units of mapped empty space, back across the boundary. The pylons were where they had always been. My instruments reported nominal. I brought the vessel back to the transect and held station for what I think was about 2 hours, though I did not look at the chronometer and I cannot be certain. Then I went back to work. I completed the boundary confirmation. I verified the positions of all 12 innermost markers. I noted in my survey log that marker positions were consistent with existing chart data and that no corrections were required. I noted, in the appropriate data field, that my vessel had not crossed the threshold boundary during the survey. I noted this because it was the field that the mandate's addendum had addressed, and I filled it in, and I will not pretend otherwise to anyone who reads this later. I recorded a false datum. In 43 cycles I had never done that. I noted it false and I completed the mandate, and I brought the vessel home. On the 3rd day after our return, I went to the Bureau's working chart room, the one that contains the master composite of the known galaxy, the successor to the wall chart in Dravarthes's studio, and I asked for access to the western threshold section. The archivist on duty gave me access without comment. I spent 3 hours at the chart table. I extended the blank. Not by much. 3 centimeters on every axis in the master chart scale. 3 centimeters at that scale corresponds to approximately 40 stellar units in actual space. I adjusted the margin in the Bureau's notation system to reflect the extension. I updated the boundary designation index. I refiled the section under GX 7741 theta with the new boundary positions and the notation. Margin corrected following boundary confirmation survey. Previous boundary positions considered insufficient to reflect true extent of designated exclusion zone. I signed the amendment with my surveyor seal. No one questioned it. I am a principal surveyor, 3rd rank. I have been doing this for 43 cycles. When I amend a chart, the chart is amended. The structure is inside the new margin. Whatever is written on those walls, whatever is encoded in that end wall map, whatever is carved in that mark over the western region, it is now inside the blank. Not inside human space. Inside the space around it. Inside the buffer. Inside the margin of a margin. The blank around the blank. The border of the thing that is the border of the thing. I do not know if that is enough. I do not know if enough is a concept that applies to this situation. I have one more thing to set down, and then I will stop, because there is nothing more to say that is within my competence to say. When I was imaging the end wall in the last minutes before I left, I was moving the vessel slowly along the surface, close enough to resolve individual marks in the columnar text, still not close enough to read it, but close enough to see the formal structure of it clearly. The columns were dense and regular. If it was a record, and the visual grammar strongly suggested that it was a record, it was an extensive one. Many entries. Many cycles, or many events, or many observations, encoded in that space. Near the bottom of one of the columns, near the floor, Near the edge of the floor diagram I had imaged earlier from altitude, there was a mark that was not part of the column. It was set apart from the column text, outside the margin, in the space between the column and the floor diagram. It was smaller than most of the marks in the column. It was in a different script from the column text, and it was in a different script from the mark on the end wall, and I say different script, but what I mean is that it looked newer. Not new, nothing in that chamber was new, but less old. Not carved with the same tool or the same technique, not made at the same time as everything around it. I imaged it. I have imaged everything I saw in that chamber, and the image of this mark is in the record with all the others. I cannot read it. It is in a script I do not know, from a time I cannot fix. But a margin note is a margin note regardless of the language, and the visual grammar of a margin note is the visual grammar of an annotation added after the original document was complete, by a hand that came later and found something worth noting. Someone else had been in that chamber. Not the makers. After the makers, someone else, at some point between 400,000 years ago and GX 7741 Theta, had entered the chamber and stood at the base of that column and added a note. I do not know who. I do not know when. I do not know what the note says. What I know is that the note is there. What I know is that I found it, and that finding it changes the calculation. Not about whether to extend the margin. I was always going to extend the margin, from the moment I saw the end wall, from the moment I understood what the mark meant. But it changes the calculation about what the margin is for. I extended the blank because I understood, after seeing the end wall, that the blank was the correct cartographic notation for the datum. You do not annotate your datum. You leave it unmarked. You measure from it, and you do not look at it directly, and you build your entire record of the known universe around it without ever treating it as something that can be contained within your record. The blank is not ignorance. The blank is the correct notation for the thing that makes all other notation possible. But the margin note changes that. Because if someone else went in there, someone after the makers, someone who came after the 400,000-year-old record was complete and found it and stood at the base of that column and had something to add, then the blank around human space is not only the datum's margin. It is also something that has been found before and noted before and extended before, probably, by whoever made that note. Someone before me looked at the end wall and understood what the mark meant and walked out of that chamber, and did what they needed to do with what they had seen. I do not know if they extended the margin. I do not know if they filed a record. I do not know if they told anyone, or if they were believed, or if they simply went home and spent the rest of their life not speaking about it. I do not know what species they were, or when they lived, or whether their species still exists. I know they were in that chamber. I know they left a note. And I know because the margin note is on the wall and not in any bureau record, and not in any of the 43 cycles of survey data I have reviewed in my career, that whatever they did with what they saw, it was not filed. It was not shared. It was added to a wall inside a blank sector in a chamber that no one is supposed to enter, and that is where it stayed. And I know this because the only records I have of that chamber are my own, made on the 68th day of a boundary confirmation survey that I was not authorized to take inside the threshold. There is a chain here. I have thought about this chain often in the months since I came back, in the long hours of the night when I am not sleeping and the darkness outside my window has the particular quality of the void inside the boundary, the same waiting stillness, the same absolute patience. There is a chain of individuals, each of whom crossed a line they were not supposed to cross, each of whom found the chamber, each of whom saw the end wall, each of whom understood, in whatever way their own professional formation allowed them to understand, what the mark meant, and each of whom came back and did not file a public record. That chain runs from whoever left the margin note, through however many others may have come and gone and left nothing at all, to me, sitting at this table in the middle of the night, writing this out by hand because I do not trust a data terminal. I am not certain whether the chain is reassuring or terrifying. I think perhaps it is both. The chamber has been found before, and the blank is still intact, which suggests that the people who found it made the same choice I made, or a choice close enough to the same that the outcome held. But the margin note is still there, and it has not been added to, which means that whoever left it either did not come back or came back and chose not to add a second note, and I cannot know which of those is true or what it implies about the interval between their visit and mine. What I can know, what I do know, with the certainty of someone who has spent 4 decades reading the implied narrative of a chart, is that the chain is older than the Bureau. It is older than the Consortium. It is older than every institution in this part of the galaxy by a margin so large that the comparison is almost meaningless. The blank has been blank for 400,000 years, and in all that time, in all the visits the chamber may have received from whatever species came and went and found the end wall and understood the mark and left again, the blank has remained. That is not an accident. That is not inertia. That is a discipline, practiced across species and centuries and civilizations that rose and fell without leaving any other legible trace, all of them arriving at the same conclusion by whatever reasoning their own formation allowed, and all of them, choosing the same answer. Not a gap, a decision. Made once, made again. Made in every generation by whoever happened to be, the one who crossed the line and found the room. I have been a cartographer for 43 cycles. I have built my professional life on the principle that a survey incomplete is a survey that cannot be trusted, that a record with gaps is a record that misleads the people who rely on it, that the blank spaces are problems to be solved and not things to be respected. I have spent 43 cycles believing that the job of a map maker is to name the unnamed. I understand now why Dravarthes stood at that south wall on my 3rd day of apprenticeship and showed me the blank and said, not a gap, a decision. I understand now what he knew, or suspected, or had been told by his own mentor, who had been told by theirs, in the long succession of cartographers stretching back to whoever first surveyed the western threshold and stood at the edge of the blank and chose to leave it blank. I understand the discipline of that choice. I understand what it costs to be a person whose entire professional formation is built on measurement and designation and naming, to stand at the edge of the thing that makes all measurement possible, and understand that your professional formation is precisely the wrong preparation for what you are looking at. That everything you know how to do with an unknown space is the one thing that must not be done here. The blank is not ignorance. The blank is knowledge of a particular kind, the knowledge that a thing exists which must not be described as simply another entry in the catalog of things that can be described. There is a word in the Bureau's internal technical vocabulary that I have always found useful. The word is witness, but in its strict technical sense. A witness mark in cartographic practice is a mark placed not to indicate what a thing is, but to indicate that a thing was there, without recording the nature of the thing itself. You use a witness mark when you need to say a feature existed at this location without committing to any claim about what the feature was. Witness marks are used in contested surveys, in surveys where the primary feature has been destroyed or moved, in surveys where naming the feature would carry political implications the surveyor is not authorized to navigate. The witness mark says, something was here. It does not say what. It does not say why. It does not invite approach. It records the fact of the thing's existence in the most minimal notation possible, which is itself a kind of respect. The acknowledgement that the thing's existence matters, and that your record of it should not misrepresent it by describing it as something you have the authority to name. I think the blank is a witness mark. I think whoever drew the first blank over that region of the galactic west was doing the same thing I do when I use a witness mark in a contested survey, saying, something is here, not describing it, not naming it, not implying that naming it is within any authority they possessed. I think of Dravarthes sitting down at his drafting table and not looking at the blank again, and I understand now that the motion was not avoidance. It was the practiced discipline of a professional who had understood, at some point in his 60 cycles of work, that there are things you look at once and then turn away from, not because looking is too frightening, but because looking twice is unnecessary. You needed to look once to know. You do not need to look again. He never told me what he knew. He gave me the vocabulary, not a gap, a decision, and he let 40 years develop the rest. I wonder sometimes if he intended that. If the lesson was always meant to take exactly as long as it took, and if the measure of whether it had been learned was precisely whether the student went to the south wall themselves, looked at the blank, and came back with the right answer without being told what the right answer was. The right answer is, leave it blank. I will not speak of this survey again. I want to be clear about what that means, because I am someone who has spent 43 cycles believing that silence is the enemy of good cartographic practice. I am not choosing silence because I am afraid of what disclosure would cost me professionally, though I have thought about that cost, and it is not trivial. I am not choosing silence because I am ordered to. I have not been ordered to anything. As far as the Bureau's formal record is concerned, the survey was completed without incident, and my vessel did not cross the boundary. I am choosing silence for the same reason the makers chose to leave the end wall's mark in a script distinct from every other annotation on the map. Because some things are correctly designated by their position and not by their description. Because the blank is not withholding. The blank is the right answer. The blank is what a careful mind arrives at when it has thought about the problem long enough and understood the constraints clearly enough to know that the alternative, the full description, the complete annotation, the named and bounded and cataloged entry in the official record, would be not a correction but a destruction. You do not improve a witness mark by adding detail. You destroy its function. The record is complete, and it will be filed in a sealed division of my personal archive, and access to that archive passes to no one on my death. I have already amended my estate documentation to reflect this. The amended chart is in the Bureau's working record, and it will stay there, and the blank is 3 centimeters larger on every axis, and that is the only public record I will leave of what I found at the end of the 68th day of GX 7741 Theta. If someone reads this record, if someone finds it, if my sealed archive is opened without authorization, if some future surveyor follows the same questions to the same blank and finds this file before they do what I did, then I ask only one thing of them. Look at the margin note, image it carefully, add your own if you need to, and then come back across the threshold and extend the margin and do not describe what you saw, because description is possession, and that thing has not been possessed by anyone in 400,000 years. And the correct notation for a datum is not a name. The correct notation for a datum is a blank. Leave it blank.